Ladies and gentlemen, may I welcome you to the Danube Institute. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm its president, and I and my colleagues are embarking here today on a new series of lectures and critical events, namely a series on films. Now, because obviously we're an institute which is concerned with social, political, theoretical ideas, we are doing so with the intention of exploring what these films have to tell us about all of those things. Initially, when we had previously held a film night, as it then was, in a previous accommodation, we concentrated on films about communism and post-communism. And we have not abandoned our intention of returning to that at some point. In fact, I have a very clear intention that at some point we will launch such a season of films about communism with a showing of Ninotchka, a famous Hollywood comedy, a movie directed by Ernst Lubitsch, and written by Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett, but based upon an idea by a Hungarian writer and journalist who at that point was one of the many Hungarians who were directing some, I think, of the best Hollywood movies of the 1930s and 40s. But today, we are launching a different series, a series of film noir. Film noir has had, I think, an enormous impact, both socially in America, revealing things about American society which were not always discussed well. They were, in effect, social films, in quotes, but they were social films. They were also exciting melodramas of crime with generally a powerful moral message as well. Sometimes a moral message of despair, sometimes a moral message of how the human spirit, which has corrupted itself, can nonetheless be revived. So they offer a rich seam of inquiry and argument for anyone who's interested in humanity. Today we launch this particular series about film noir with one of the first of them. I'm going to invite Paul de Quenoy, as I say, the originator of this particular series, to say a few words. Paul is a distinguished academic who has taught both at Cairo and at the American universities in Cairo and Lebanon, who has now established his own think tank institute at Palm Beach, the Palm Beach Freedom Institute, and who is playing an increasing part in developing, encouraging, and inspiring arguments about politics and the future of America on the right. I'm going to invite him to say a few words about the film. We will then watch it, and then he will come back and he will say a little more, and he will be available to answer your questions. So, Paul, thank you very much for being the cause of this evening, and I invite you to say a few words before we show the film.
Thank you, John. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming this evening. As John said, my name is Paul de Quenoy, and a lot of my teaching had to do with cultural history in the different institutions where I was a professor. I'm now also the publisher of Academica Press, which is my family's company, and John's one of our authors. Forthcoming book there. But I've come today to talk more about film noir. Now, I want to start with a question. Who has seen the Maltese Falcon before? Okay, a handful of you have seen it. The rest of you, don't worry. I'll share a polling statistic with you of 74% of American millennials have never seen any film made in the 1940s or 1950s, including Casablanca. And when I taught the Second World War course at my university, I would always ask the students, and granted these were Lebanese students largely at the American University of Beirut, Who's seen Casablanca before? You just have one nervous hand going up, almost afraid to admit having seen a black and white film, of all things. And one of the things I would tell the students when they objected to having to watch black and white films was that you can do things in black and white. In fact, you have to do things in black and white because color makes it either irrelevant or uninteresting. And one of the major advantages of the black and white medium is that you're using shadow, you're using line, you're using contrasts, and you're using these different camera angles to get across messages that you could very easily do if you had color film. But of course, they didn't really in 1941, with some exceptions. Gone with the Wind had been made in color. The Wizard of Oz, the Oz part of it's in color, even if the Kansas part's in black and white. But this medium lends itself to what we call film noir. And I'll talk a little bit about first why we call it film noir. The term comes from the French media. It's usually accredited to a man called Nino Frank, who was born in Italy, but became a very distinguished French film critic beginning in the 1940s. It's inaccurate to attribute it to him. The phrase film noir had been used in the late 1930s to describe certain French films that had characteristics in common with what we would call film noir today. In fact, the first use of it that we can document was in the reactionary royalist newspaper Action Française. Right, so it comes from the French right to describe films that had dubious moral characters, that had a kind of lack of humanitarian interest, that had a certain degree of unsentimentality, all of which you will see in this film and in the other films we'll be doing in this series. John mentioned the series. There were 5 highly influential American films in this genre that were shown in France in the summer of 1946, all of which had been produced during World War II. Because of the war, obviously they couldn't be brought to France, which was under German occupation, to be screened. So they got them all at once in these summer film series. And every important French director of the post-war period would be influenced by them in the so-called New Wave or Nouvelle Vague genre of French film. And those directors of the 1940s. The rest of the series, Maltese Falcon is the first one from 1941. The other films in that group of 5 are Otto Preminger's Laura. Raise your hand if you've seen it. Good? 2 of you? All right. We have The Woman in the Window. All right, that's a good one. All right. Double Indemnity. Sure. All right. And what's the 5th one? Well, we said Laura. No, The Big Sleep is 46. That's right after the war. It's definitely a film noir, but it's not one of the 5. Murder My Sweet. That's the one. Yeah, and that's 1960. So that's significantly later. Yeah, there are large numbers of film noir, but the 5 ones that were shown in France at this time are the ones we're concerned with. Right, so it would be a great book, John, I think, if we put every lecture together on all the 5 films. What you'll see in the Maltese Falcon, why is it called the Maltese Falcon? It is a quest story. Quest stories are intrinsic to our psychology as humans. Right? But it's a perverse quest story. The normal quest story has a hero who develops moral character through his quest. The object of the quest is generally irrelevant. And indeed, what they're looking after in the Maltese Falcon is a black statuette that's supposed to be a jewel-encrusted bird figurine. And it has a very exotic history. It was supposedly presented by the Knights of Malta to the King of Spain. It had gone missing for hundreds and hundreds of years, and a team of criminals are working internationally to try to locate it, and they've been at this task for many, many years before they believe it's arrived in San Francisco. Right? And again, it has no particular value except to the characters. They're deeply emotionally invested, as you can see in both the book and the film. We'll talk about the book in a moment, but in the film you'll see this great obsession with the Maltese Falcon and what it means to them. To us, it means almost nothing. It also means almost nothing to the main character, the detective who gets involved with this group almost by accident. His name is Sam Spade. He has a particular reason to be called Sam. The author of the original novel, published in 1929, is Dashiell Hammett. Dashiell Hammett's birth name was Samuel. And Dashiell Hammett's career, he dropped out of school when he was 13. Eventually, he became a Pinkerton detective, a licensed private detective working for this huge national agency in the United States that would provide extra security in parts of the country that did not have regular law enforcement, or for individuals or companies or interests that needed private security. We still have this phenomenon today. In fact, to prepare for this lecture, I looked up how do you become a private detective now? And guess what? It's like everything else. It requires coursework, licensing, passing a test. I looked at the Florida requirements for becoming a private investigator. If publishing and institutes don't work out for me, who knows what the future could hold. But this is Dashiell Hammett's own history, and what he wrote about his novel, which was published serially in 1929 in a detective journal called Black Masks, and then as a full book by Knopf in 1930, was that Sam Spade is the character all of the detectives I've ever known wish they could have been. And we understand it also to be a personal depiction. It's a loosely semi-autobiographical. He did say, I only write about people I know, people I've encountered. And Sam Spade's apartment is in a building in San Francisco that very much resembles the one Dashiell Hammett lived in while he was writing the Maltese Falcon. So, of course, you don't need any more evidence than that. Yeah, you can do an entire tour in San Francisco of places associated with the film, because they're all actual, or were actual places in the city at that time in the 1920s and 1930s. I wouldn't recommend you do it at night if you've been in San Francisco lately. It's a very different and scarier place. But you can find all of the locales mentioned in the Maltese Falcon, at least the address, and see what's become of it. It's important that Dashiell Hammett's book came out in 1929. What was the other great event of 1929? It's the stock market crash, which was itself only the most outrageous incident in a series of economic scandals that had affected every sector of the American economy. Real estate, financial investments, the banks, all of them were suffused with massive greed. None of them were particularly well regulated. We don't have a Securities and Exchange Commission yet. We don't have elaborate bankruptcy laws. This is very much a hurly-burly of uncontrolled capitalism happening at that time. The Maltese Falcon also comes in at that moment when the biggest social phenomenon is still prohibition. In the United States, we had prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation, but not the consumption of alcohol. You could legally drink under prohibition. You just couldn't sell it, transport it, or make it. Now, of course, that opened a whole new field of endeavor for anybody bold or desperate or greedy enough to work outside the law to produce, transport, and manufacture alcohol. And that, in turn, led to a massive fascination with crime and criminals. In films of that era, this is when you start to see the very first gangster movies produced, films like Little Caesar, Public Enemy, the original version of Scarface. We all know the do we all know the Al Pacino Scarface from the 80s? There's actually a 30s film that's the inspiration for that. Right? 1932 Scarface. It's an Italian immigrant instead of a Cuban immigrant, but more or less the same story. So this public fascination with crime, this public fascination with greed, this great disappointment with high finance capitalism and its perceived failings all feed into a public thirst for films like the one we're about to see. And as you look at the character of Spade and his development, He's a private detective, which means he is responsive to law, but not entirely within the law. He's responsive to criminals, but not entirely of the criminal world either. It's a common theme in all of those 5 movies and many others, but in the 5 movies that we'll be seeing, Sam Spade's a private detective. Murder in My Suite is also a private detective. It's a different one. It's Philip Marlowe from Raymond Chandler. The Chandler book adaptation is from Farewell, My Lovely, but he's also a private detective. In Double Indemnity, it's an insurance investigator, played by Edward G. Robinson. Since when is an insurance investigator a hero? Usually these are people who try to screw you out of your insurance settlement when you have an accident. but nevertheless, this is the hero of Double Indemnity. In the other films, in Woman in the Window, again, it's an Edward G. Robinson character. He's a psychology professor who has to confound the district attorney in a murder investigation, who happens to be one of his friends and a fellow member of his private club. So you have that antagonism with the law going as well. And then in the final film, in Laura, it actually is a police officer, but it's a police officer who, because of his obsessive love for a woman he believes is dead, goes way outside the acceptable bounds of professionalism. And it functionally is not a detective any longer. Right? So this is what you have to look forward to in the series. But all of these anti-heroes are fundamentally outside of law enforcement and very mistrustful of law enforcement. In Dashiell Hammett's book, as well as in the film, you'll see a scene where Spade encounters the district attorney who all but accuses him of murder. Right? He is the victim, to make this very contemporary, Spade is the victim of police brutality. There's a point where a police lieutenant slugs him in the face because he says something smart, and the police detective punches him. Right. So we have this distrust of institutions, a distrust of the law, a distrust of the underpinnings of the society, and characters who are immensely greedy. Now, I'll let you watch the film, so we'll start the film now, and then I'll come back and say some more after we've all seen it. Then everyone in this room will have seen the Maltese Falcon. Let's start at the end. What is this? The stuff that dreams are made of. The line is not original to Dashiell Hammett's book. Can anyone identify the quote? Tempest.
No, it's a tempest. It's prosperous fast speech.
Exactly.
I do know that. I don't know anything about the film.
Dashiell Hammett would not have known that because he left school at 13. He wasn't up on his Shakespeare, but that was inserted at the end.
By John Huston.
Yeah, but by John Huston, the director. And we'll talk about the making of the film, in addition to that, and some of the other structural things about this, and also about the cast, which has interesting resonances for our purpose today. So John Huston was the director of the film. That was his first movie. He had been a Hollywood screenwriter before. He worked with William Wyler on movies in the 1930s quite successfully. And he actually had written into his contract a clause that said that if Warner Brothers optioned one of his scripts, he would be hired as a director of another film. Why does he get the Maltese Falcon? This was not considered an important picture by Warner Brothers. They had already made it twice. Remember that the novel was published serially in 1929 and then as a composite book in 1930. In 1930, Warner Brothers bought the film rights from Dashiell Hammett for the princely sum of $8,500 and made a movie that came out the following year, 1931. 1931 is still before the Hays Code. The Hays Code was a de facto censorship regime in Hollywood. We did not have proper film censorship in America. Rather, the film industry agreed to regulate itself according to guidelines that they got from government officials. So what you see before about 1934 can be much more sexual, much more criminal, much freer than what comes between, say, 1934 and the late 1950s, early 1960s. And the first film was also called The Maltese Falcon. They later changed the name to Dangerous Lady to avoid confusion with the 1941 version. You see Sam Spade as quite the ladies' man. And indeed, here it's hinted at, but in the book he has sexual relationships with both Miss Wonderly, Miss O'Shaughnessy, and with his partner Miles Archer's wife, Iva. You see her here dressed as a widow all the time, and he's always putting her off. And also it's implied with his secretary. She's not just a secretary he relies on. These are the women he's pursuing. Right. And the film follows more or less the same plot, although the dialogue is not quite as good. The second making was in 1936. The first film had flopped. They created it as a kind of dark comedy called Satan Met a Lady. Why is it Satan Met a Lady? In Dashiell Hammett's book, Samuel Spade is described as having very angular features that make him look devilish and diabolic. So if you take that out of the book, all of a sudden you get this Satan-like figure that's Samuel Spade. But they actually make this into, as I said, a dark comedy. The Caspar Gutman figure, the fat man, is played by a fat woman. So they actually changed the gender of the main criminal character, and it's not the Maltese Falcon that they're pursuing, but it's rather the hunting horn of Roland of Roncevaux, another ridiculous object that comes from some primordial past and is the object of their obsession. It also, again, it's post-code, so it's not nearly as sexual, but it is actually quite a funny film. It also failed. So when they had to give a movie by contract to John Huston to direct, they picked one that had already been done twice. They didn't think it would be that big of a hit, but it became one. And I think if you having just seen it, one of the reasons why is that there's an enormous economy in dialogue and also in place and in movement. How many sets do we have in the movie? Think about it. We see Sam Spade's apartment, we see Sam Spade's office, and we see a couple of hotel suites. That's all you really need to tell this story. The characters don't move very much. The major shot of Sydney Greenstreet is taken from a low angle, and it's him sitting in a chair so that you can see his massive girth sitting in this chair. You want to see that he is really the fat man. This, by the way, was Greenstreet's first movie. He was 61 years old and had never acted in pictures before. He had a long career as a stage actor, but had always resisted offers to appear in film. This was the first time he did it. After this, he became a hit Warner Brothers star. He made 24 more films in the remaining 8 years of his life. Right. And of course, you see him again with Peter Lorre and with Humphrey Bogart a year later in Casablanca. He makes a huge impression. He's only in 3 scenes. He has about 12 minutes of screen time, but he's an unforgettable figure. And of course, we see him parodied ever since. Right? There's always this Greenstreet-like character either in Looney Tunes or in The Simpsons or somewhere you will see the fat man doing something shady. Right? And you know it's Greenstreet from the Maltese Falcon. The way they did the script, I think the dialogue here is the most important thing. It's very punchy dialogue with a lot of slang that's now very outdated. Like, who knows what cracking foxy means? Who knows what horse feathers means, right? These are all 40s slang. If you get into it, they're kind of fun. It's fun to learn, and it's fun to drop on people sometimes because then they don't know what you're talking about and they feel stupid in addition to being made fun of. So it's like a wonderful way to be dissociative. But the slang that is used by Hammett actually comes from the milieu that he knew. Now remember, he left school when he was 13. He only had 1 semester of high school. So he did not have a super education by any means. And when very well-educated people try to write novels, one of the reasons they fail is that they are not doing dialogue in simple, everyday language. Hammett, from his experience as a Pinkerton detective, knew simple, everyday language, including a lot of criminal jargon, including the way people talked on the streets and in everyday life, and he combined it into this absolutely tight novel with spectacular dialogue. How does it get into the film? It's a perfect accident. When John Huston was commissioned by Warner Brothers to make the movie, he went to his secretary, gave her a copy of the Maltese Falcon and said, I want you, as a preliminary measure, to copy out all of the dialogue in the book and break it up into scenes. Later, we can take that and expand it, embellish it, make it something more sophisticated. Somehow, Jack Warner, the head of the movie studio, got that summary, the copied dialogue with the broken scenes, looked at it and said, John, this is a great script. You're going to start making the movie this week. And Huston actually never admitted that. If you read his memoirs, when he gets to that topic, he doesn't tell that story. Other people who were around him tell that story later. But his story was, no, this was just my brilliance of how I did this. My neighbor in Palm Beach is the actor George Hamilton. And when I told him I was coming to give a lecture about the Maltese Falcon, he had known Huston as a young actor, and he's like, Huston was the most arrogant son of a bitch I ever met in my life. He went on for about 15 minutes about how terrible John Huston was to him when he was making pictures in the 60s and 70s. Huston remained active really up until the late 1980s when he died as a filmmaker. And again, this was his first film made when he was about 34. But that was the script that you get. It's simply Hammett's dialogue with some minor amendments and changes that would come later. What does the Hays Code do to the film? Obviously, the book's sexual relationships between Sam Spade, his secretary, his partner's wife, and the Bridget O'Shaughnessy, Mary Astor character have to be toned down considerably. In fact, he spends the night with both of the leading ladies in the film. In the book, here they have these furtive kisses. So that has to be taken out. They also had to reduce the amount of drinking that goes on. Like, there's a lot of drinking in that society. That culture is a very boozy culture. In the Maltese Falcon, you do see them having a little bit of whiskey here and there, but they were instructed by the studio not to have so much alcoholism going on because it's bad for moral efforts. Now, what do the criminal characters all have in common? Caspar Gutman, Joel Cairo, Wilmer, Bridget O'Shaughnessy. They're all gay.
They're
all of them are gay.
Gay?
Gay. They are homosexuals.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, every single one of them.
Which one again?
All of them, all of the criminal characters.
Cairo?
Yep. So Joel Cairo is the Peter Lorre character is the most obvious one. Oh, look what you did to my shirt. You know. And the line on Joel Cairo in the script instructions that came back from the Production Code Administration when they were making the movie was, he cannot be characterized as a pansy. That's not a nice word to use, but that was the actual quote from the instructions that came from Richard Breen, who was the head of the Production Code Administration. And it said, try to take the Nazi qualities out of him. It's another slur. Remember that for the writing of this, it's much more vivid in the actual book. When Joel Cairo makes his appearance at Sam Spade's office, the secretary comes in and says, "This guy's a queer." It can't be more obvious than that, right? But they had to downplay this because the moral implications were not acceptable at the time. And also there was a practical reason. Gay characters that were portrayed in film in the 1930s, the typical audience reaction to them was to laugh at them. They were funny. They were figures of fun. And if you made a movie that's supposed to be a hardboiled detective film that has a gay character and your audience, the first thing they do is start laughing, it's going to spoil your whole effect. So they have to be made a bit more subdued and a bit less dangerous, right, in that way. So they have to become more serious characters. What about the other ones? What do we know about Wilmer and Gutman? Why are they in the same hotel room together? Why is he called a gunzel? What does that word mean? Well, it has the word gun in it, right? So you might think gangster. No. It's actually from German through Yiddish into English. It's the diminutive of the German word Gans, which means goose or Gänzel. It becomes Gunzel through Yiddish into English. It is a young homosexual, a gooseling. That's the slang term. Bogart says it 3 times in the movie here. Let's give him the Gunzel. Right? And Gutman obviously has no other romantic interests. He talks about a father-son relationship. It's all a bit weird. But in the book, of course, it's much more expanded. And what about Miss O'Shaughnessy? Why is she gay? Why is she we believe she's a lesbian. Why would that be? What are her relationships with men like? She uses them. She uses intimacy and sexuality to get their way. She has no legitimate romantic interest in any of them. In the book, she has an infatuation, mutual infatuation with Sam Spade's secretary. Now, why is that important? For Dashiell Hammett, who in the course of the 1930s, after his book was published, became a communist, homosexuality for the progressive left at that time was a sign of Western decadence. It wasn't an alternative lifestyle that we should celebrate in the name of diversity and inclusion and whatever. It was a bad thing. It was a symptom of the bourgeois West causing all kinds of problems. Most communist countries made homosexuality illegal in their criminal codes. So to have that as part of this world was, again, to speak to its corruption. These are deeply, deeply troubled people. They are emotionally invested in pursuing this object. They're immensely greedy. They betray each other all the time. And if you accept that this is a quest story, again, they're after something which the object of the quest isn't very important. It could be the Maltese Falcon. In Satan Met a Lady, the 1936 version of the book, it's the horn of Roncevaux, Volant from Roncevaux. It really doesn't matter what the object is. It's the quest that does it. By the way, 18 years later, in 1959, Alfred Hitchcock would make North by Northwest, and the object of that, the so-called MacGuffin, to use Hitchcock's term for it, is another statuette which contains microfilm. We don't know what's in the microfilm, it's not important, but another cast of characters very similar to this one. You have, in that case, Cary Grant as a kind of rough anti-hero, is being chased by an international gang of criminals led by James Mason, including a seductive blonde. Mary Astor's blonde. You don't really see it in the black and white, but Eve Marie Saint on a multi-city quest for this particular object. The quest motif traditionally is supposed to be enlightening. The hero develops character and experience through his travails. He learns wisdom through the quest. What do the evil characters in the Maltese Falcon learn? Nothing. They become more degenerate. They become less and less in control of themselves and their emotions. Whatever veneer of civilization they have disintegrates the second they face any kind of serious challenge. If you through the 30s. He was romantically involved with Lillian Hellman for nearly 30 years. They never properly married, but that was his main relationship. She was part of that communistic or fellow traveler circle as well. And of course, in the 1950s, when there were investigations into communists in Hollywood, Dashiell Hammett was called as a witness by the House Un-American Activities Committee, refused to answer questions about a bail fund he had set up for communists who were escaping from prosecution, and was actually sent to prison for a short period of time, where we were told he was made to clean toilets. So that's the long-term fate of the author of the Maltese Falcon and other detective stories. We can talk also, let's see, what else? How much time do we have? Another 5 minutes, huh? I could go on for hours about the Maltese Falcon. Well, let's do a question. Why not?
You make it a connection to the McCarthy area? Really?
Well, because Hammett himself, he lived until 1961, and he was very active in that movement. So when he didn't name names, you could be held in contempt of Congress and criminally punished for doing that. The film was a smash success at the time. This is the third remake of the Maltese Falcon since the 1931 version. It came in under budget, but I think got 6 times the actual investment in the film back in immediate revenue. They talked about making a sequel, The Further Adventures of the Maltese Falcon, but it fell apart because if you think about it, all the characters, bad characters, get arrested and go to prison. How about Mary Astor in the elevator at the end with the bars coming across like she's already in jail? There was actually, we should mention, a scene that was cut. They did film the proper ending of the novel. The novel doesn't end with that scene in Sam Spade's apartment. It ends at his office. He goes back in. The secretary says, "Oh, God, I'm sorry this happened." And then he gets a message, "Mrs. Archer would like to see you." And he says, send her in. They actually filmed the sequence, and it went into the preview of the film when it was first shown. Jack Warner looked at it and said, no, we have to take that out. It's too contrary to the Hays Code, so that's why you get this ending. So the original ending where the affair with the widow is confirmed is removed. A copy of the statuette, they made several copies of the actual Maltese Falcon for the purposes of the film. It was professionally sculpted, sold for $4 million at Christie's in 2013. So the legacy of the film, of course, is very much with us. And if you look, especially in The Simpsons, the montage of scenes from this film is really quite impressive. That they use different characters and different scenes that are famous from the movie. And very often, when you show this to students, they'll recognize the Simpsons images before they realize that this is having ever seen the Maltese Falcon. So if there are questions, I'm happy to take them. I think I've said all about it I need to say and stayed within the time limits, but happy to talk about it more.
We'll come get a microphone.
So, I mean, one of the, well, you haven't really discussed Bogart in this.
We can talk about the actor, sure.
Deeply ambivalent figure as well.
This is actually a new role for Bogart. His earlier acting had involved playing bad guys. He was always playing gangsters or criminals, very one-dimensional in a lot of cases, although some of his earlier films were quite good. He had a contentious history with Warner Brothers. Up until a few weeks before the film was made, he was actually under unpaid suspension for insubordination. They told him to make a film he didn't want to make. He disappeared on his boat and didn't answer anybody's calls, and his contract was suspended by Jack Warner. They restored him for this, again, because they didn't think it would be a particularly important film. Now, of course, what happens is that he becomes iconic Humphrey Bogart. And when he is challenged to make the right decision, to govern his passions, to follow the course of reason with regard to what he's going to do at the end, does he give her up to the police? Does he lie and save her and hope that they fall in love? He makes the right decision, despite being a hard-bitten cynic, despite having a lot of negative experience of life, despite having a use of his fists that might not be so very wholesome. And we also find out that he's been in trouble before with the law over his license, over criminal activity. And he's part of that underworld. He's close enough to it. But nevertheless, he can cross over and make the right decision. He plays essentially the same character a year later in Casablanca, the much more famous movie, where his history is, again, quite questionable. Remember that Rick of Rick's Cafe had been a gun runner. He'd been an arms dealer, right, in the 1930s. He had some kind of underworld-like nightclub connections in Paris. And then in Casablanca, he sticks his neck out for no one. He lets people be arrested in his cafe. He bribes the police to stay open. But when he is put to a real moral test, does he save the Paul Henreid character? Does he save Victor Laszlo from arrest by the Gestapo? He makes the right decision and returns to this much more idealistic point of view where he joins the resistance and goes off in the end to fight in the war. That will remain the standard Bogart character, and also scholars have argued a great idea of American masculinity. Like, you're supposed to be rough and tumble, but at the same time, when you are asked to do the right thing, you do the right thing. We talked about Green Street as well. For Mary Astor, why is she special in this movie? First of all, her scenes, she would purposely hyperventilate before every scene she was in, so that she would have this kind of flushed expression and shortness of breath and quickness of voice in those scenes. So she was one of 17 actresses considered for the part. They talked about Geraldine Fitzgerald, they talked about Olivia de Havilland, they talked about Rita Hayworth, they talked about Paulette Goddard. Really all of the star actresses of Warner Brothers were considered for the role. You understand, in those days, the studio system worked very much like a factory, and the different actors were components that you hope you could arrange in the correct order. So for Mary Astor to do that, and this is a great choice. She had also been the victim of one of the biggest Hollywood sex scandals in the history of movies. She had been in a bad marriage and kept a very, very detailed diary of her extramarital affairs. So when the divorce and child custody case came through the courts, her diaries were subpoenaed, read out loud, and leaked to the press. They were referred to as the purple diaries because purple's nefarious. So she was publicly humiliated by this deep exposure of her private life at a time when this was way less acceptable than it is now. So she was already a tainted figure the minute she steps on stage, for anybody who knew that history, which had only just happened in the previous years. The other striking character is Peter Lorre. His most famous movie was Fritz Lang's M, where he depicts a child murderer. Again, it's a German film from 1931. Fritz Lang you'll encounter later because he directed... Which of the other 4 movies did Fritz Lang direct?
He did Laura.
No, Otto Preminger was Laura. Fritz Lang did A Woman in the Window. Right, so Fritz Lang, who would have a long Hollywood career himself, had directed Lorre as a child murderer, and he was immediately recognizable to audiences all over the world as that child murderer. And even with his success in this film and also as the hideous Ugarte in Casablanca, he would remain tied to that role. There's a funny story about this. In the 1970s, Peter Lorre's daughter, Katherine, was abducted by the Hillsdale Stranglers in Los Angeles, serial killers who targeted young women for rape and murder. They abduct her in the disguise of police officers, search through her bag, and find a picture of her with her father, Peter Lorre. They were so impressed. Why? Because they recognized Peter Lorre as the criminal from Fritz Lang's M. They were so impressed that they let her go. It's like, wow, he's our icon. Yeah, it's okay. Go on. It's fine. This is decades later, but that's what he's known for, this kind of shady character. And yet Peter Lorre's background was on the Vienna stage in the 1920s and 1930s.
He was Hungarian, wasn't he? Was he Hungarian?
He was not exactly Hungarian. He was born in what's today Slovakia, and they were a Jewish family that ended up gravitating...
Laszlo Lowenstein.
Levenstein Peter, yeah. Yeah, but of a Jewish family that he ended up growing up in Vienna and he actually studied at their business school. So don't say you can't do anything with business school. You can become a great actor like Peter Lorre. And when he comes to Hollywood, he's mainly in character parts. But once he starts acting in this way, people realize actually he's a really phenomenal actor in these kind of offbeat roles. So it goes in that direction. So this becomes a huge success. And they all have major careers, especially Bogart. This is transformative for Bogart's career. He goes from being like a stock bad guy to being the absolute conscience of an American male in the middle of the 20th century and beyond. Right? And there are imitations of Sam Spade going on into the future as well. Particularly, he starts to take over the character of Philip Marlowe. Later in the series, we'll have Murder My Sweet, which is, again, the hero is a hard-boiled detective, much like Sam Spade, only it's Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe. And the Marlowe character lasts really up until, I think, as late as the 1990s. They were still making at least remakes that were never as good as the original.
There was a Robert Mitchum one.
Yeah,
Dick
there's
Richards.
a Robert Mitchum one. There's a
James
Garner one. There's like the
Farewell, My Lovely.
Yeah. But that trope will go on as what American masculinity is. And today, when it's very much under assault, we talk about toxic masculinity. It's interesting that we never talk about toxic femininity, which is what you certainly see not only in this film, in the Mary Astor character, but in all of the other ones. You'll see some aspect of toxic femininity, right? The femme fatale.
Could I just ask you to talk a little bit about that very interesting line in his speech to Brigitte O'Shaughnessy at the very end, in which he says, don't think I'm as crooked as I seem to be. Over to you.
Oh yeah, don't think I'm as crooked as I say. He needs to seem crooked to function in his society, but in his soul, when he has to make moral choices, at least really important moral choices, then he is what he's supposed to do. And remember also that within the Hays Code, and when it approached criminality, the main features were that you could not show any crime to succeed without punishment. So all criminals had to be apprehended in the end. This is why when you watch The Woman in the Window, the original story has the hero commit a murder and get away with it. Now, how do you get around that for the film version that's under the Hays Code? You make it a dream sequence. So the story unfolds as it does in the original short story that's based on, but the film itself is a framing device that surrounds it. So that way you can say, I didn't really do that. It was all a terrible dream. But it's a complete, that part's a complete fiction.
Has there anybody got questions from the audience?
Yes, I've got 2 points that are really connected. It's interesting you said that the dialogue was taken straight from the book, because I found it, as dialogue, completely unrealistic. And I thought the actors had difficulty in actually saying some of it in a realistic way. Then going on from that, it was interesting you said an earlier version was a semi-comedy. I think they played quite a lot of it for laughs.
Well, was it intelligible language now? It wouldn't be common language today.
No, but people don't speak in those long paragraphs that they were speaking in.
At that time?
No.
The paragraphs probably not. The speeches less so. But the actual dialogue, when he's interacting with police officers, when they're having these battles of wits, that would have been understandable to anybody working or living in that environment today, right? Or at that time.
It's when they have longer things to say.
The longer things to say, yes, that's probably true. But most of what succeeds, do you remember the long speeches or do you remember the short lines?
Yeah.
Well, I found it all a bit difficult to understand, actually.
Well, that's actually part of the problem because our intonations in American English have changed considerably. Also, the slang of that era, much of that is no longer with us. These are things you have to look up on the internet to understand properly much of the time. But to the audience they were addressing in 1941, it was a very different thing. And the film was actually extremely popular.
And there were some superb one-liners.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, that bit where after his partner dies and O'Shaughnessy sort of tears up and says, was he married? And he says, yeah, he had 10,000 in life insurance, no children, and a wife who hated him.
Yeah, the use of...
a lot of lines. Yeah, there's a couple of lines like
that.
Yeah,
and
that's very part of that noir
and remember,
style.
Particularly in this 20s, 30s era, when there's a huge amount of disappointment in public institutions, when there's massive corruption in the economy, the tendency to sarcasm was huge. Sarcasm became its own medium. And I think in our culture today, that's been replaced by irony. And very often the irony, at least among younger people, I missed being a millennial by 2 years, but millennials communicate in this irony that's usually like pointless, or at least to me it sounds pointless. And they're being ironic for its own sake. But I think it's a battle. There's a tension between sarcasm and irony in how Americans talk to each other. And at that time, it's an extremely sarcastic culture. Because you don't accept anything at face value, right? The object that we're seeking is the stuff that dreams are made of. I'm not as crooked as I seem to be. You know, so nothing is real. Or if you think of the scene where they're having this confrontation in Bridget O'Shaughnessy's hotel suite, and the police detective says to Joel Cairo, I want you to tell me the facts. And he has this look on his face like, facts? Of course. And it's a funny line because nobody would believe that people would speak with sincerity.
May I offer the fact that we've got 4 little bottles of wine that John and I contributed in the back, and maybe we could go have a little pour and we can have a little conversation in the back.
Nice idea.
We sort of need to wrap up now.
Okay.
All right.
All right.